This week on Quadriga, Putin's Russia. Who cares about democracy? Russian President Vladimir Putin has been showing a new hardline since he was sworn in 1 year ago. His unprecedented third term was made possible by a change to the constitution. Thousands demonstrated against a system they view to be corrupt and repressive. Rights organizations have accused the Russian government of persecuting those who disagree with it, assisted by a repressive security apparatus and a compliant judiciary. The trials of punk activists Pussy Riot, as well as raids on NGO offices, are the most obvious examples. Does true democracy have a chance in Putin's Russia? Your host today, Terry Martin.
Hello and welcome. Russia is supposed to be a democracy, but its leaders and its institutions are looking increasingly undemocratic. Is this contradiction a problem for Russia and its global partners? And if it isn't yet, could it become one? That's what we're talking about this week on Quadriga. Our guests on the program this week. Sergei Sumleny is the Germany correspondent for the Russian business journal Expat. Before moving to Germany, he also worked extensively as a broadcast journalist in Russia. Lucian Kim is a freelance journalist and blogger based in Berlin. He spent several years in Russia as a political correspondent with Bloomberg News and as an editor with the Moscow Times. Daniel Brössler is a parliamentary correspondent in Berlin with the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung. He served for several years as the paper's Moscow correspondent. So, Sergei, Vladimir Putin has been back in the saddle as president now for just about a year. It's his third term. He's put his stamp on the country very much so. What impact would you say Vladimir Putin has had on Russian democracy?
Well, you're right. Technically, it's the third term, but for Russian political system, it is still the fourth term because everyone knew in Russia and everyone accepted it that Vladimir Putin still rules Russia, even if he was a prime minister, only prime minister, and not a president. So, but of course, you're right. He has come back, and he must re-establish his power systems because during that 4 years of the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev, some people have started to try to find the limits of freedom. And now Vladimir Putin, who has suffered from the big demonstrations a year ago, re-established his power systems, and he's doing it very well.
Lucian, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev recently gave a speech in the U.S., and he said that politics in Russia today is basically imitation democracy. Is that too harsh?
I don't think so. I think that's actually exactly what's going on. The parliament is an imitation parliament. The courts are imitation courts. The only office that has any power is the president's office. So it has all the trappings of a democracy as we know it, all the institutions, but when you look behind them, they're empty.
Daniel, another term that's often used to describe democracy in Russia today is managed democracy. What is this idea of managed democracy, and is it really democracy?
No, if it's managed, it's not democracy because there is no free play of powers here. And there was never real democracy in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Even in the 90s, we did not have democracy. Then we thought there might be a path to democracy. And then there was this 4 years with Medvedev being president. There were some people in the West, here in Germany as well, hoping that now Russia is sort of returning on that path. But that is not the case. That was never the case. And there is just no democracy in Russia.
Well, I think Russia would argue differently. Russia would say, well, of course, Russia is a democracy. We have elections. They are democratic elections. We have democratic institutions. How can you say that Russia is not a democracy?
The question is, could you imagine that really somebody would challenge President Putin right now? Is that possible? Would it be possible in this system to challenge the president?
He's extremely popular.
He is popular, but he is popular with parts of the population. What he has been doing for this year now is to rely on one part of the population, the larger part of the population, I would say, and to alienate other parts of the population. In the big cities, for example, we saw the protests. And there he was challenged, and I think that scared him to a degree. That explains, in my view, why the system is so grim right now, because he was really astonished to see that happen, to see real protest, to see something that works outside the system of managed or imitated democracy. And that shows that the system is not perfect and will never be.
Okay, Sergej, let's talk about some basic democratic freedoms. When we think about a democracy, we think about holding free and fair elections, that you have the power to change your government, that there is a certain amount of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Are these institutions not intact in Russia?
Well, even if we criticize Putin's Russia, we have to accept that today's Russia is more free society than any Russian society since the last maybe 1,000 years. Even in the Tsarist time, the freedom of travel abroad, for example, was pretty limited. I don't mention the freedom of speech. And of course, now Russia is a more free society. The problem is that the progress we observed in the 90s, where we went from the undemocratic society to the democratic society, is stopped. And even worse, that evolution of the rights of freedoms is turned back. We have now the situation during the last 2 years, we have collapse of most freedoms the Russian society has gained, maybe half freedoms, maybe 1/4 freedoms, but they were in the society, and the society doesn't have it now. You have mentioned and you have agreed that Russian society has, for example, some sort of freedom of speech, some sort of freedom of commerce, trade, etc., etc. That's true. But the problem is that you may, as a citizen, you may use these freedoms only for private consumption. You may, for example, travel abroad to buy you some cloth in Milan or in Paris or in London. But as soon as you start to travel to London to contact some political groups, some Russian exiled politicians, for example, your freedom will not be okay for you, and you will be maybe put in jail.
So go ahead.
May I just say one thing? I think, yes, you're right. It is probably the free society in Russia we have seen ever. But the question is, how free could it be? How free it actually potentially could be today? And I think there was a window of opportunity in the 90s to open the Russian society to free society, and that window was closed. And that is actually the problem we see today,
I agree completely.
Let's look specifically at freedom of expression right now and dissent. Amnesty International, the global human rights organization, just recently published a report describing what is happening in Russian politics as a witch hunt against criticism and dissenting voices, critical voices. Is that a fair assessment, Lucian?
I think if we look at what's happened since Putin's inauguration a year ago, it's clear that he's various opposition figures, whether they were the girls from Pussy Riot, whether it's the anti-corruption blogger Alexei Navalny, and people that were involved in a big demonstration right before the inauguration. This is clearly very targeted against basically anyone who voices any kind of dissent in a loud way. And so I think it's fair to call it a witch hunt. I mean, it's about intimidating. It's about scaring people from going out on the street. I think it's really true that Putin was frightened when he saw these crowds. And I think Putin learned his lesson when he was a KGB agent in Dresden, here in Germany, in the late 80s. He saw people power in action and how the people of East Germany and later in Czechoslovakia as well took down their government just by going out in the street. And I think he has made the decision or learned the lesson and drawn the conclusion that it was a mistake to let those people go out in the street. So don't even let 1 million people, don't let 100,000, don't even let 1,000 people on the street.
Now, there were a lot of people on the street in Moscow, particularly in Moscow, during the elections in 2011. You were a blogger out on the streets. You were working, I believe, also for Bloomberg still in 2011. What did you learn about Russian democracy in tracking those demonstrations?
Well, I had actually left Russia shortly before the demonstration started. And as soon as I heard about the demonstrations, I returned from Berlin to Moscow. And I can say I couldn't believe my eyes. And I think this disbelief was shared by the people who went on the street. Everyone was disillusioned by sort of the cynical system, the way Putin used Medvedev simply to stand in for one term, how he came back. Everyone was thinking, are Russians really so passive? Do they really not care about their government? And all of a sudden, just like that, there were tens of thousands of people on the street. So it was actually a very encouraging moment for people who are concerned with democracy in Russia, because you saw people being empowered and taking matters into their own hand in a peaceful way.
Daniel, when you say someone is going to Russia today, going to Moscow, and someone who is coming from Germany and is accustomed to enjoying the democratic freedoms here, what sort of adjustments would they have to make, or would life just be able to live a normal life?
Well, to a certain degree, it probably would be a normal life. I think if you come as a foreigner to Russia, democracy is not the first thing you're interested in. What you're interested in is probably a legal state. Probably if you're going to invest in Russia, you're looking for a legal state.
The rule of law.
So, the rule of law. So what would be your concern? Corruption would be probably your concern. The way the state is dealing with you. So it's not so much democracy, but it's what you have to get used to is that you're sort of powerless, you're sort of without rights. It always could happen to you. As a foreigner, you're still, to a certain degree, protected. But you have to get used to a very different life and to a very different way the state, the government is treating you.
I'd just like to interject in that. I mean, your question was about a foreigner going to Russia, but I would say actually it's for Muscovites the same. They're maybe not thinking primarily about freedom of expression and other sort of abstract ideas. They're thinking about the same things. Corruption. How do I get past this official? Are they going to stop me? Are they going to raid my business? Is a traffic cop going to take away my license and demand a bribe? That's what drove people out onto the street in the end. It was not because everyone has such great, lofty, philosophical ideas about democracy.
Sergei, you mentioned that when you come up against the when you come up against the Russian state, this is when things start to come undone in terms of Russian democratic institutions. Which Russian institutions are, we'll say, most compromised? Is it the judicial system? Are we talking about the security forces? Is it the political system as a whole? Is the parliament somehow part of this?
You may continue.
There's a longer list.
It's a longer list, exactly. The problem in Russia is that you can pick almost every institution, and you will not find any institution that is not corrupted. Traditionally, people say, well, the people who work for a state for little money, the teachers and the doctors, are maybe the most good persons. But if you go to a Russian hospital in Moscow, you will see broken windows. You will be treated with the drugs that were out of usage in the European Union 20 years ago, and you will have to pay for everything. So corruption is even in schools and in hospitals. You may not bring a child to school without paying some thousand of euro to the director of the school if the school is good, and it's public school.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, corruption is not something that just happens in countries that happen not to have democratic institutions. You can look in Southern Europe, and that sort of corruption is there as well. We need to kind of distinguish, I think, between corruption on the one hand and compromised democratic institutions on the other. Or are you saying that there is an explicit relationship?
Well, the big problem of the December 2011 was that the elections that took part in December 2011 were forged in that size that was never seen before.
So this was a rigged election.
Exactly.
The parliamentary elections in 2011 were rigged.
Then people felt insulted. When you know that in Moscow, for example, 50 up to 60% voted not for the United Russia, for ruling party, and then you suddenly see on TV screens that 60% voted for it. When you see the TV program, the state TV program, and most TV programs in Russia are in state hands, you see the table with the percentages of the voices given for that party and that party, and if you add all of them, you will get 146%.
Okay.
It was an insult. It was an insult.
I think there is a link between corruption and the lack of democracy. When I was in Russia, a friend of mine told me, well, you know, I want to live by the law. I want to stick to rules, to democratic rules, to all that. But it's not possible. It doesn't work in this country. Everybody has to be corrupt to a degree, to pay for services where he should not pay, and so on. And that's part of the system. It's part of the power. Because the state actually at any moment can find anything against you, you know, because you in your life did things wrong, things you should have not done, paid bribes where you should have not paid, and so on and so on. So that's part of the system.
Exactly.
It's to corrupt the whole entire society.
It was exactly what state tried to do 1 year ago, 2 years ago, against some activists of the opposition. The street police officers stopped their cars and said, well, you've turned left when you may not. We can solve this problem for €10. And it was filmed hiddenly. And they said, well, look, they speak about democracy, but they bribe policemen.
It's what happens to Khodorkovsky. Of course you can argue that he did things wrong and that he broke laws.
As you can, who was imprisoned several years
former
ago.
oligarch who is still in prison. The thing is that there are many oligarchs who did the same thing and they are not in prison. Why are they not in prison?
Okay, let's step back just for a second now and think about how all this is perceived within Russia. You've got, we've just heard allegations of a corrupt judiciary, a corrupt law enforcement service. We've heard suggestion that there is a completely rigged election, parliamentary elections in 2011. That's an allegation we've heard many times. What do the Russian people think of this when they see, okay, corrupt judiciary, rigged elections? Are they okay with that, Lucian? They simply accept this?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think it's different things. A lot is made about Putin's popularity. I think he's still at 60%, despite everything.
This is the enigma of Russia when people from outside look at it and say, well, why is this accepted? Why is Putin so popular?
I think the fundamental problem is, well, there are a couple of problems. One is that, freedom of media, that alternative or non-state opinions even reach a mass audience. But I think it's also a deeper problem is sort of an immature political culture. I mean, under communism, even before communism, it was a very unitary system that didn't support any kind of dissent or civil society. And I think a lot is made of Putin's so-called popularity, but I would actually argue that it's less popularity and more sort of a passivity that bred from seeing that whatever you do, there are no results. So only you'd have to be a fool to actually try to fight the system instead of maybe just try to lead your daily life. And I think his support is maybe not even as big. I think people know, when you speak with Russians across the country, everyone is complaining about the same thing: the schools, the hospitals, and the corruption that has really infected and contaminated every institution.
But don't forget that 60% of population of Russia have no access to any TV channel except of two biggest state-owned channels. If you live in a small city in Siberia, you see the corrupted policeman, the corrupted major, maybe sometimes the corrupted governor. You never see Putin. But you see that on two biggest TV channels, you see a good Tsar Putin who comes personally to distant cities, and people come to him and say, Mr. Putin, dear president, look, our governor is corrupted, please help us. And Putin criticizes him personally, and then things are turning good. That's why people write to Putin, they write letters to Putin. An old babushka writes him a letter, please, our major doesn't repair streets in my small village, please help us. And then Putin, that's why this direct line of phone calls to Putin. The people have to have a good Tsar, and good Tsar is Putin, and he's shown on TV. And of course, if 60% of people have to consume this picture, they start to believe it. Only 6% of Russians speak foreign languages. This
is the point that you've made there about freedom of the press, or lack thereof, I think is extremely important. But how do you account for that? I mean, you've all worked as journalists in Russia. There doesn't seem to be this freedom of the press. Why not? What's holding it back?
Well, to a degree, there is freedom of the press, and that's actually the smart part about the system. It's
but if
smarter.
60% of the country only has access to 2 channels.
There's a truth.
State control.
That is the point. That is the point. I think this system is smarter than the Soviet system used to be, because in the Soviet system there was no freedom of the press at all, no freedom of speech at all. Here, this system is more flexible. The question is, does it threaten me as a president, us as a system, or not? Television. Free television and real reporting about what is going on in Moscow, that would threaten the system. A small paper,
it's repressed by the state.
So it's repressed. A small paper with a small circulation is good to show we have freedom of press. It's good because there are intellectuals in Moscow who need that, who you need to keep calm, and they have their papers. They have even a radio station, Echo Moskva, which is still, to a degree free. And it's not really threatening the system. So it's more flexible, it's smarter. If it would threaten the system, it would be forbidden.
So this is kind of democracy light, ostensible democracy or managed democracy. We're coming back to that term. I want to go back a few years and revisit a comment from former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. He was asked in a talk show in 2004 if he felt that Vladimir Putin at that time was what was called crystal clear Democrat. And Gerhard Schröder replied, well, yes, I think he is, and he's going to make Russia into a genuine democracy. Looking back, Lucien, do you think that was just wishful thinking? Was there any reason to believe nearly 10 years ago that Russia would indeed become a genuine democracy?
Maybe 10 years ago there was still a little hope, but 10 years ago there was a key event that happened. That was when as Daniel already mentioned, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was put in jail. And this, for a lot of people who were observing Russia inside and out, this was kind of a turning point where it became clear that this path to democracy was not such a straight line as people had hoped. The other point I would make about that is that Gerhard Schröder is a personal friend of Putin. And what Putin has been very adept at doing is building personal relationships with leaders in the West. I don't want to get ahead of you if we want to touch on that a little bit later.
Can I just say a word about Gerhard Schröder? The interesting thing is that he, of course, did not believe that. And he later said that as well, that he did at that point not believe that. The question for him was, he says, should I say he's not a crystal clear Democrat, because this was the question. And he did not want to offend Putin because there was a personal friendship. That's the point. There was a personal friendship, and his decision was in no way to offend Mr. Putin. So not even
diplomatic.
Yeah, if you want to call it that way, yes. But not even he believed that. Okay. But what he believed, and what he believes to the very day, and what some people in Germany still believe, is exactly that you should not criticize Russia. Just let them do what they're doing. Let's not criticize it because it's not our business. That's a different question.
Well, that's what I'd like to talk about next in the rest of the program, is how the rest of the world sees Russia. Russia is indeed a power to be reckoned with still in the world, not just because it happens to be the largest country in the world.
Russia's military might and nuclear arsenal were clear outward signs marking it as a true global power. But many now question whether Russia plays the same important role in today's post-Cold War environment. Russia does, however, hold a few key economic and political properties from which it draws its geopolitical influence. Germany and the EU are heavily dependent on Russian natural gas and oil. The veto power associated with Russia's permanent seat in the UN Security Council gives President Putin influence on the most important global policy decisions. So while Putin's new hardline has drawn extensive media attention, foreign leaders have been very slow to criticize Russia's strong leader too sharply.
Last year, Russia passed a law requiring any organizations receiving foreign funding to register with the authorities and report regularly to the authorities. They had to register as foreign agents. Now, this has angered many foreign governments, including Germany. Sergei, what's behind that law?
Oh, that's a very old tradition of finding enemies outside of Russia. If you look back to the Soviet Union, that word agent, it is, if you look at the law, it looks fine because agent is someone who acts. And if you take some contracts, you'll see the agent 1, agent 2. But in the common mind, in the common language, agent is a foreign spy who tries to sabotage our motherland. And of course, it is an attempt to say to the common people, look, these guys get money from United States Department of State. Why do they pay money for our NGOs? Of course, because they want to ruin Russia. And you have not to forget that after this law, there were wild actions of some Kremlin-near group of youth who came to the offices of NGOs, who came with cameras, who came with spray, and who just written on the walls of these NGOs, foreign spy, foreign agent. It looked like some really bad pictures from the past. And of course, Putin, he tries from one hand to make the society more unite. He says, well, we have an enemy, and we must stay together, stay close, because otherwise we will be destroyed, as Soviet Union was destroyed by the Western countries, as he says. And from another hand, he tries to divide the society. And that is very dangerous, because he says this part of society, this 20%, 30% who criticize me, they are funded by the Western countries, and they are enemies of us.
Lucien, it sounds like paranoia to me.
Yeah, I think the
paranoid state.
I think a problem that was already addressed earlier about this, whether you call it paranoia, is that Putin has been in power now for 13, 14 years, and he has lost touch. I think this is definitely a problem, and in his decision-making, what kind of information he gets, I think he's making conclusions based on very scanty evidence, and yeah, it's quite dangerous when you don't have all the checks and balances, and when one man is in control.
This foreign agent law, do you think that Russia knew that it was going to anger foreign governments so much with that? When they introduced it and said, that's okay.
I think so. I mean, what's interesting when you listen to Putin explain what the foreign agent law is, and other laws that have gone into effect in the past year, the standard Russian government answer is we are simply implementing the same kind of laws that exist in the West. And with the foreign agent law, the official answer is there is such a law in the U.S. and it's been around since 1930 or 1930s. And of course, what the detail that doesn't come out in that is that in the 1930s there was fascism in Europe, there was Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and many foreign governments were really trying to influence the U.S. the way the U.S. was functioning. And so this was a requirement for foreign agents. It is.
Daniel, Germany has been really upset about this, and this is a point where the government has provided some gentle criticism of Russia, if you will, because two of Germany's largest parties, democratic parties, have foundations that are very active in Russia and elsewhere in the world. Has Germany's criticism been robust enough, in your opinion?
Well, I would say that the German criticism is quite robust, and it's not just coming from the government, it's coming from the parliament as well. There was a parliamentary resolution last year, pretty strong. We know that the German Foreign Ministry was not too excited about this and tried to prevent it to a degree, which was not possible. And that is interesting because there was a debate in Parliament and the parliamentarians said, no, we have to say that. We have to say the truth about Russia. And I think it is difficult in Germany to suppress this truth. There is this feeling that you have to say things like they are, and I would say the Schröder policy, not to criticize Russia, is actually not working any longer, and it's not working to a degree as well because we have a different chancellor now, a chancellor coming from GDR and having strong opinions about Mr. Putin and about the system in Russia.
Chancellor Merkel does not go into the sauna with Vladimir Putin as former Chancellor Schröder might have. Sergei, does the criticism coming from other countries in response to this foreign agent law impress Russia at all?
No. Actually, I could humbly assume that the criticism that comes from West makes a Russian government to feel good. They say, well, we have found the real button we have to push to make them angry, and you can see the Russian reaction, for example, on so-called Magnitsky law in the United States. What have Russian government done? What have they done? They have forbidden U.S. Americans to adopt Russian children. And officially it was said that it's not because of Magnitsky law.
The Magnitsky law effectively blackballed a number of Russian...
Very small number, about 1 dozen or 2 dozens.
Not allowing them to travel to the United States and looking after that.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then the Russian parliament said, well, we will... as a revenge, we will block the Russian children to be adopted by the U.S. Americans. And officials were said, no, there is no connection between these situations. It's just because one Russian child was killed in an American adoptive family. But until now, if you go to the website of Russian Duma, of Russian Parliament, and you will look the documents for this law, anti-adoption law, they all named Magnitsky Act. So the person who have created these documents, he has named them Magnitsky, and it's an old tradition of Russian foreign diplomacy. They try to, even in the Soviet Union, they try to find some nerve points and to attack them and say, well, they will be angry, they will make a mistake, and then we will show in Russia, look, German President Wolf is corrupted. Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi is corrupted, Greece is collapsing, the European Union confiscates our money on Cyprus. Look, the Western is exactly as corrupt as we are. So you want to get Angela Merkel and President Obama as your rulers? No, you have a Russian Vladimir Putin who is not more corrupted than the foreign leaders. Enjoy him.
Well, from outside of the country, we look at Russia and we see, possibly a rigged parliamentary election in 2011, very weak democratic institutions. Lucian, do you think that because Russia does have weak democratic institutions, that affects its ability to project power abroad, both hard and soft power?
The lack of institutions prevents it from...
That the weakness of democratic institutions in Russia, that this compromises its ability to project power, or quite the opposite?
Well, I think the fact that there isn't a vibrant civil society that's grown up in Russia in the last 20 years does hurt Russia in the sense that Russia has lost it's lost its soft power since communism, because there was certainly a great appeal in the world. The Soviet Union as an alternative to the capitalist system, and it has lost that. And even its hard power is kind of it's not certain how functional the Russian army really is, except for its nuclear weapons. So I think. Sort of in a more taking a step back, I think the fact that there isn't a civil society, that there isn't more democratic development, of course, this affects its influence also in the neighborhood, because what country wants to be like contemporary Russia? All its neighbors are looking elsewhere.
So you have a country that has nuclear weapons. It has veto power in the UN Security Council. It has loads of oil and gas. This is the source of its wealth. The rest of the world looks at Russia and says, we need to keep Russia happy. In terms of foreign powers criticizing Russia or negotiating with Russia, is Russia in a position of strength?
Well, that's a question that is difficult to answer. I think you have pragmatically to deal with Russia. Of course, there is some strength. As you said, it's a veto power in the UN Security Council. Look at Syria. It is impossible to solve this situation without Russia. And
Russia
there are a lot of
continues to support the Assad regime.
Exactly, and it will. There's no sign that it might change its policy. So, of course, there's power. And the question for the West always is how to deal with it. I would say it has to deal with it pragmatically. It has to avoid to strengthen the system in Russia. It should avoid everything that is perceived as really support for this kind of democracy, which it is not. But it has to deal with it. You can't say, well, we're no longer talking to Putin. He is the president, and you have to talk to Russia, and you have to deal with Russia, of course. The point is that all those who think criticism of Russia is wrong argue exactly that. So because we need Russia, so we shouldn't criticize it. I think you can do both. You can criticize Russia and you can deal with it.
Well, I think one problem is the idea was always we need to engage Russia, and one way of engagement is by supporting civil society inside the country. And with the new laws and this clampdown, it's becoming very difficult to engage also with certain elements in Russia that are working for free elections, human rights, and press freedom, and these kind of things. So it's becoming very difficult because I think Putin does feel after the protests that this is some kind of end game, and he's not going to tolerate any of this, anything that might in some way threaten his rule.
Russia still does have leverage in international affairs. We see the important role that Russia is playing also in negotiations with Iran, for example. This is really a key player in that region. Is that likely to stay that way? And if so, why, Sergei? Is it...
It is the same situation as with Magnitsky and anti-adoption law. Russian policy. Russia has not that much friends abroad, and
is it diminishing? I'm just trying to get an idea of what the trajectory is here. It appears to be diminishing.
Well, Russian government strongly believe in zero-sum game in international relations. They say, well, if the United States will win or will gain some more space, some more influence in the world, we will lose. So our object is to support those who make troubles for the United States. So that's why let's support Iran, let's support Syria, let's support other regimes. Of course, there are different groups in the Russian society and in the Russian government. Some say, well, the Iranians they buy our weapons. So if they will be U.S.-American friendly, they will buy Abrams tanks and not T-80 tanks.
So Russia is a large weapons supplier.
Exactly. One of three largest. And there are, of course, other objects. We have oil and gas contracts with Iran. We have had with Libya.
Talking about oil and gas contracts in general, contractual law in Russia is obviously a point of contention. The lack of a strong judiciary, the lack of the rule of law, is that affecting foreign investment in Russia?
Well, it was always proud of Russia to present, even in Soviet Union, even in Cold War time, we were always being a good supporter of oil and gas. We have never broken our contracts. That is the idea that is repeated by Russian foreign ministry every time when the Western countries...
there have been price hikes and cutting some countries off.
But of course, if you speak about the investments of private persons or smaller companies in Russia, of course they are not that secure. But as Western companies get that high margins in Russia, you will never be able to sell that much Mercedes in the best shape as you sell in Russia.
I know you covered the oil and gas industry in Russia for a while, Lucian. Is that the case, that because of high margins, companies are willing to accept maybe lack of solid contractual law?
Certainly high margins, but it's also just Russia's mineral wealth. A lot of publicly traded oil companies in the West understand that to keep big reserves on their books for their shareholders, it's very good to go into a partnership with Russian companies. See BP, see ExxonMobil, and you can just make a long list of basically all the top European and American oil companies, which have, and so it's about these. Obviously, these companies aren't worried about even so much the contractual, because a lot of it depends on the personal relations.
They can't afford not to be there. So we only have about a minute left. I just wanted to ask you quickly, Daniel, how do you see this moving forward? Is this going to continue on a Putin sort of trajectory for the future of Russia, the managed democracy?
No, I don't think that can work forever. It can work for quite a while. We don't know how long it can work, but will not work forever, because this system is not able to modernize itself. It's not creative enough. It's not really working well, and that's why it's not going to be there forever.
What do you think, Sergei? Last word.
I think it will be more hard, and Russia will act under the motto, import iPhones, don't import democracy.
We do have just a second. Lucian, how do you see it evolving?
Well, I completely agree. It's a system built on one man, and that man is getting older.
His days are numbered. Okay. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much, Daniel, Sergei, Lucian, for joining us, and I want to thank you for joining us here at Quadriga. Hope you'll tune in again next week. Thanks for watching.